Hi everybody. So in this session, we will see what are controllers. After that, we will see what are routes, and later we will see what are the filters in the controllers. So let's start with the controllers first. In MVC, the C stands for the controller, and its job is to serve as a middleman between the model and the views. So whenever a request hits a server, the router delegates that request to respective controller, and now the controller is responsible to process the request and generate the appropriate response. Doing so, if any data is required from the database, the controller will get it from the model and pass that data to the views, so to create the response. As controller is nothing but a class only, it do have some naming conventions. So the first letter of every word should be capitalized and the last word should be in pluralized form. So in Rails, you can create the controllers using the generator command. So the command will be something like Rails generate controller and the name of the controller. Alright. So let's create a blogs controller which will be responsible to handle all requests related to the blogs resource. Okay. So the command for that will be Rails generate controller and then the name of the controller. So in our case, the resource is blogs. So the name will be blogs. Notice that we have pluralized the name. Okay. So the generator have created some files. So first is the controller itself. Then after it have created a folder for the views, the test files, the helper files, and some asset files. All right. So the blogs controller was created inside the controller folder, and notice that we have provided the name as blogs only, but the file name is created as blogs underscore controller. So basically this part will be appended by the Rails. So whatever name you provide here, the underscore controller will be appended to it. Sorry, prepended. So if we go to this blogs controller, we can see that the blogs controller is a class which is inherited from the applications controller. So by default, every controller in the application will be inherited from the application controller. Now, inside this controller, we can write all the business logic required to execute the request inside the methods. All right. So before knowing what are actions and methods inside a controller, let's understand one thing. As the router delegates the request to the respective controller, so how come this router knows which request will be served by which controller? So for this, we define these routes in the routes file and let the router know which request will be served by which controller. Now, the controller will have a method defined inside it which will be serving this request. So once the router knows which request to call, Rails will simply create a instance of that controller and respective method will be called. Now, controller might be serving one request or maybe many requests. So particular controller will have all the respective methods to serve all the corresponding requests. Now let's see what are actions. So actions are nothing but those are methods only which have a corresponding route associated with them. So those methods are responsible for handling a particular request. So inside a controller, if there is a method which does not handle any particular request, then that method will be called as a method only. And if there is a method which is responsible for handling a particular request which has a route associated with it, then it will be called as action. Now say we want the list of all the blocks inside our application. So now let's go ahead and create action for this request. Alright. So for this, we will need to define the route first. So let's go to the route file, which will be inside the config folder. And let's define a route. So we will understand how to define the routes. For the simplicity, let's just write resources blocks, which will be creating all the basic resourceful routes for the resource block. Okay. So now let's go to the console and let's check what routes have been defined using this command Rails routes. So it will tell you what routes have been defined in your application. All right. So we can see that there are several routes defined for this resource block. So these are nothing but the basic resourceful routes. So by this route, we can get list of all the blocks. So this both are for the create operation of a particular block. Then this is for the editing a particular block, and this is to show a particular block, and this is to destroy, and this both are to update the particular block. All right. So now let's go ahead and start the server. Okay. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to list all the blocks which are in our application. So we can use this particular request, and let's try to hit the server with this request. All right. Please notice that we have yet not defined a particular action which will be serving this request. So when we hit this request, we are getting this error that the action index could not be found inside the blocks controller. So let's go to the console first, and all right. So what we see here is that this particular route. So first of all, the URI pattern for this is the slash blocks. After that, it will be a get request, and it will be served by the blocks controller by the action as index. So as clearly we have not defined this action yet, so we are getting this error that this index action is not defined inside the blocks controller. All right. Now let's try to define this index action, and let's just keep it empty for now, and let's try to reload this request. All right. So now it is saying that this particular action is missing the template. So basically the controller now knows what to do, but it does not know what to return. So let's go ahead and let's just write something like render and just say hello world. So the meaning of this is we are telling the controller that to render this string basically, and the format is HTML. All right. Now if we reload this page, it is saying hello world. All right. Now as we needed to send the list of all the blogs inside our application, we can do something like blogs.all, and we can change this to JSON and just reload, and boom, we have list of all the blogs inside our application. So we have got the list of 2 blogs. All right. Okay. So we will see this render and all the supported formats in detail inside the views session. Okay. Now let's create another action which will be responsible for the creation of the blogs resource. Now in RESTful API, as the resource here is a blog, URL pattern for this particular request, the creation of the resource will be /blogs, and this particular request will be a post request. Now when we define the resource blogs in our router, we have already defined this particular request. So if we go and check what routes are defined in our application by running this command rails routes, we can find this particular request which is post request. The URI pattern is /blogs, and this particular request will be handled by blocks controllers create action. All right. Now let's start the server and hit this request. Now for this request, we will be using the Postman API application. It is used for developing the APIs and testing them out. So the URL will be localhost 3000/blogs, and this particular request will be a post request. All right. Now let's send this request. Okay. So it is saying that the action create could not be found in the blocks controller. So clearly we have not yet defined this action inside our controller. So let's go and define it first. Now that we have defined the action, let's go to Postman and hit the request. So in order to create the blog, we will need to send the required data. For example, the title, the description, and the creator's ID, right? So we can send this data as a post parameter inside the body as JSON. So let's add this data. All right. So I have added this data. Now this data we are sending in a body. We should be able to access this data inside the controller in order to create the blog, right? So in Rails, we can access this data by using the params hash, which is available and accessible in all the controllers. Now, as params is a hash, you can access the data by just passing the keys. So for example, this title will be available inside the params hash inside the title key, and this description will be available inside the description key inside the params hash, and so on. So let's check this out. So before hitting the request, we will be adding a breakpoint in our request. So what a breakpoint does is it halts the request, and we are able to execute any statements inside the context. So we will be using a bybug gem for this, which is used for debugging and adding the breakpoints. So this bybug keyword serves as a breakpoint here. All right, now let's hit the request. Now as the request is halted by the breakpoint, let's go to the console. As this breakpoint is in our controller, we can access the params hash here. So we can see that whatever data we passed, the title, the description, and the user ID are available inside this params hash, and we can easily access them by passing the keys. All right. So now what we can do is just create the blog by using this data. So we can assign the data by using something like this. So now if we check, the title is assigned. All right. Now we can assign the rest of the attributes. Now that we have assigned all the attributes, we can just hit save on this new record and it will be inserted to the database. So if we check last blog, we can see that the blog was saved. Now assigning these values one by one can really become hectic, and it will be very less readable if we are dealing with many more fields, right? So there's got to be a simpler and more readable way of doing this, right? So in Rails, we can use hashes for the mass assignment. So basically, if we pass a hash, then Rails will map the keys inside the hash to the fields inside the models, and it will assign the values for you. So basically, we can write something like this for creating a new record. So whatever keys present inside this params hash will be mapped with the fields of the blog, and Rails will assign them for you. But there is problem with this mass assignment, as it will assign any parameter present inside the hash which get maps to the models field, right? So if there is any field which is not intended to be updated by the user's input, an attacker can easily update that field by just passing it inside the params hash. So to solve this particular problem, Rails have strong params. So basically all parameters inside the params hash are blacklisted by default, and if user needs to mass assign, then the user will need to whitelist them. Now the developer can whitelist them by using the permit method. So what this means is, if we move ahead and use the params hash, so currently we have not whitelisted any parameters inside this params hash. And now if we use this params hash directly without whitelisting the parameters, Rails will throw an exception. So basically it is saying that the parameters you are trying to mass assign, those are forbidden parameters. All right. So we can whitelist these parameters by using the permit method, and we can just add the parameters we need to whitelist, something like this, and it will whitelist all those parameters. So at the end we can see that all these parameters are permitted. So now if we try this and try to save this, we can see that all the whitelisted parameters were directly mass assigned. So the title, description, and user ID was assigned. So if we only whitelist the title, it will only assign the title and will skip the other parameters. Now let's first release the bybug. We can do that either by typing whole continue keyword, or else we can just type C and hit enter. You can go to their website and check all other commands which bybug provides us with. Alright, now let's go to our code and let's update it. Alright, so I have updated the code. So what I have done is I have whitelisted the title, description, and user ID parameters. Then if the block gets saved successfully, then I have passed a JSON with a success message. And if it fails, then I have passed a JSON with a failure message. Now let's go to Postman and hit the request. So now we can see that the block was successfully saved. So now if we go and check inside the logs, we can see that the record was inserted. Now in addition to the whitelisting of parameters, the strong params also provides us with some more interesting and useful features, such as you can also mark some parameters as required parameters. So if that particular parameter is not present inside a request, that request will be treated as a 400 bad request and it will be handled by Rails. Now let's check that. Let's move to our code. So we can require the parameters by using a require method, and we can pass what parameters are required. So let's say that the parameter my blog is required in our case. As we are not sending any parameter as my blog, this request will be failed and it will be marked as a 400 bad request. And if we see that what is the error, it is saying that the param is either missing or the value is either empty for my blog. Now if we add this my blog parameter, let's move all this inside this my blog and let's send this request. So now it's saying that it was saved successfully. Alright, so if we go inside the Rails guides and inside the action controller overview, we can find the strong params, and here we can find all the useful other features this strong params provide us with. So with specifying the permitted parameters, we can also specify the scalar type of those parameters. We can also specify the nested parameters as well. So please check this all examples. Alright, now let's move towards the routes and know what are those and how to define those. So routes is nothing but it is a way of telling Rails which request will be handled by which controller's action. So the job of routes is to identify the URL pattern and to dispatch the request to a particular controller's action, which will be responsible for handling this particular request. Alright. So we define this routes inside this routes file, which is located inside the config folder. So earlier we defined this route. Let's remove it first. And let's define a route which will be responsible for listing all the blogs inside our application. So let's define the route for this. Now, in order to define this route, we will need to know three things about this particular request. So first thing we need to know is that what will be the HTTP verb for this particular request. So in our case, as we are listing all the blogs inside our application, it will be a GET request. After that, we need to know what will be the URL pattern for this particular request. Now, as our resource is blog and we are listing all blogs, the URL pattern will be /blogs. And last thing we need to know is what controllers, which action will be responsible for handling this particular request. So in our case, the blogs controllers index action will be handling this particular request. So let's define this route. So first of all, it will be a GET request followed by the URL pattern for this, which is blogs in our case. And lastly, we need to tell Rails that which controller's action will be responsible for this particular request. So in our case, it is blogs index action. So this is how we let know the Rails that which action is handling this particular request. So in this case, the blogs is a controller, and anything that follows this hash will be considered as an action in this particular controller. So we are referring to this index action. All right. Now let's move ahead and list all the routes defined in our application. So by using this Rails routes command, we can list all the routes defined inside our application. So now we can see that there is one route is defined, which is basically a /blogs routes. It is a GET request and it will be handled by the blogs controllers index action. Now let's start the server and hit this particular request. So as it will be a GET request and we will not need to send any body, let's hit the request. And now we can see that all the blogs have been listed. All right. Now we also need to define one route which will be responsible for the creation of new blog. So again, in that case, the HTTP verb will be a post verb here. After that, the URL pattern will be same as earlier. It will be /blogs, and now this particular request will be handled by the blogs controllers create action, which is this one. Let's first check what routes are defined. All right. So we can see that this post route is defined in your application. Now let's try to hit it with Postman. Post request, and we need to send a data. So we can see that it was successfully handled by the create action. So here we can see that this request was served by this blocks controllers create action. Now again, if we want to use the update action and delete action, we'll have to define those routes for this particular resource, right? So this is very tedious for a developer to go and define all the basic CRUD operations required for a resource, because these basic CRUD operations are almost required for all the resources, right? So actually Rails have provided a better option for defining all these basic CRUD operations for a resource, which is by using this resources and defining it like this. So what this will do is define all the basic CRUD operations for this blog resource. Now let's check what routes have been defined for our blogs resource. We can see that the basic RESTful routes have been defined for our application, which is the listing of blogs, the creation of the blog, after that the updation of the blog, and the deletion of the blog. All right. So now let's say we do not need all of these routes, and we just need to define only two routes, which is the index and the creation of the blogs. So we can pass the only option, and we can pass the index and create action to it. So what this will do is it will only define the routes for actions we pass to it. So it has only defined the routes for this both actions, index and create. Similarly, we can also exclude the routes we do not need. Say, for example, if we do not need to define the route for the deletion of the blob, we can use the except keyword and just pass the destroy action to it. Alright, we can see that it have excluded the destroy action and it have not defined it for our resource. Alright. Similarly, if we have multiple resources and we need to define all of the routes for both of them, then we can pass them both in same line, and this will define the resourceful route for both of the resources. So we can see it have defined the resourceful routes for users and blogs. So this is known as the resource routing in Rails. So whenever you use this resource routing in Rails to define a particular routes for a particular resource, Rails provide you with some useful helpers for this particular resource. So for example, as we have defined this blog resource, Rails will provide us with this particular helper, which is a method as blogs underscore path, which will return /blogs. So now we can use this for redirection or internal routing of our application. And similarly, Rails will provide us with another helper as new underscore blog underscore path, which will return blogs new. So this we can use for the redirection and routing again. And there are many more helpers. Also, for individual underscore path, there is individual underscore URL method as well. So for example, for this blogs, we also have this URL method, which will return the whole URL for this particular path. All right. So we can check all of these helper methods in the Rails doc. So here we can find all the useful helper methods that Rails provide us with and what are the use for those. All right. So we have seen what are the resource routing. We have seen the path and URL helpers. Now let's move towards nested routes. All right. So in our application, we do have certain type of relationship between our resources, right? So for example, in our case, the relationship between the blogs and users resource is user have many blogs and a blog belong to a particular user, right? So a blog cannot exist without a user, right? So in Rails, we can depict this particular relationship inside the routes by using the nested routes. So for that, we will have to define the blogs resource as a nested resource for the user's resource. Now what this will do is this will define the resources for the users as it already does. But in addition to that, it will define the resources for this blog resource as well. But inside that, the user resource will be a required resource. Now let's go ahead and check the routes. All right. So now if we see the routes defined for the user resource first, those look normal, right? All the basic resourceful route have been defined for the user resource. But now if we take a look at all the routes defined for the blog resource, we can see that the /users and /user ID is present inside all the routes, right? So basically this user resource have become a mandatory part of the URL now, right? So basically a blog cannot exist without the particular user. So this is how we can depict this nested resource and this particular relationship inside the routes. So what this particular route will be doing is it will be listing all the blogs of a particular user, which is passed inside this user ID. All right. Now we can also nest another resource inside a nested resource. So we can also add in between here resources as well. Now let's move towards the next topic, which is namespace routing. So consider that in your application, you have an admin panel and whatever controllers associated with this particular admin panel, you need to group them all and you need to put them inside a particular namespace. Say for example, admin namespace. So what you will be doing is you will be moving all these controllers inside a directory as controller slash admin directory, and you will be adding a admin colon namespace to all respective controllers. And now what you want to do is you want to define a route which will be depicting this scenario. So for this, let's move towards the Rails document. All right. So the similar example we talked about is depicted here as well. So defining the route using this namespace, this will allow us to depict this above scenario. And what this will be doing is this will be adding this slash admin pattern inside your URL, and it will be looking into the controllers which are available inside this admin namespace. So even if there is a similar controller present with similar name articles, but it is not inside this namespace, it will not be looking into that controller, but it will only look inside the controllers which are present inside this admin namespace. So whatever actions those are present inside this particular controllers, those will be responsible for handling this particular requests. All right. So similarly, there are many interesting examples for defining the routes. So please go ahead and check them all and explore them all. All right. Now let's move towards next topic, which are filters. All right. So filters are nothing but those are methods only, which basically gets executed before or after or around a controller's actions. So there are three types of filters in Rails: before filter, after filters, and around filters. Let's go ahead and check all of them one by one. Let's start with the before filter first. So let's assume that you have a set of logic that you need to execute before executing a particular action. So what we can do is define a before filter for this and add this particular logic inside that before filter. Now let's assume for this blocks controller, before serving any request, we need to check whether the user is authorized for this request or not. If yes, then we will do nothing. If not, we will return an error message. Alright, so I have defined the before filter for this logic. So we can define a before filter using this before action keyword and passing a method to it. And whatever logic we need to execute before the action, that logic will reside in this method. So in our case, we are just rendering a JSON with a error message, and for now it will always run as we have kept a if true here. So now what will be happening is before this index action or this create action, this before filter will run. So if we try to execute the request now, we should get the authorization error. All right. So we can see that we have got the authorization error. And now if we just return a false here, we should get the list of all blocks. So that's how the before filter works. Now let's say that you have a logic that you need to execute after a particular action. So that you can define inside a after action, and you can define this after action using the after action keyword and passing the method to it. Similarly, if you want to execute any logic around the action, then you can define a around action for this using this around action keyword and passing a method to it. Now the filter method for this around action takes the action as a block, and while defining it, we need to yield this block inside. So something like this. So whatever we write before this yield will be executed before the actions logic, and whatever we write after this yield will be executing after the actions logic. Now any filter defined inside a controller is by default applicable to all the actions inside that controller. So this before action will be executing after all the actions inside this controller. Now in case if we want to execute this particular logic before a particular action only, then we can specify that using a only keyword and passing the action's name to it. Something like this. So now this user authorized will be executed only for this index action as a before filter. So now if we update this code and try to hit it, we will get the error for this. But if we try to pass a post request, it will pass. And if we remove this and now pass this, we will get the same error. Similarly, we can also exclude the actions by using the except option and passing the actions name to it, something like this. So now if we go and execute the request, it will pass. Also, all the filters defined inside the application controller will be applicable to all the controllers and their actions which are inherited from this application controller. We can also skip the before filter action using the skip before action helper and passing the filters name to it. We can also specify the only actions we need to skip this for, and now if we go and run this, it is not applicable for the create action. Alright, please explore what will be the effect of defining this filters method as public, private and protected, and please try this inside the before filters for the application controller and accessing it inside the blocks controller as well. Also try defining multiple before filters and check the order of their execution. Alright, so that was it. Thank you.